The village of Nethercombe was a place where nothing much ever happened. At least, nothing that would make it past the hedgerows and into the polite chatter at Mrs. Mead's weekly tea. On a mild June afternoon, the village seemed to have folded itself into a picture-perfect scene. Roses blooming along garden trellises, the scent of lavender mingling with freshly cut grass, and the soft hum of bees among the flowers. It was at this moment, at the estate of the affluent yet unobtrusive Mr. Edward Hargreaves, that Nethercombe's quiet life took its first tremor. Mr. Hargreaves had always been known for his love of entertaining, and today he had arranged a small garden party in honor of the arrival of his niece, the charming Miss Beatrice Fenton from London. The guest list was predictably a mixture of the local gentry, curious villagers with connections to the estate, and one or two out-of-towners whose presence lent an air of mystery to the otherwise familiar gathering. Miss Marple, visiting her friend, Mrs. Clara Brewster, who was known for her delicious scones and inexhaustible gossip, had accepted the invitation with a quiet sense of curiosity. She observed the scene with her customary calm, noting the tension that lurked behind polite smiles and the way certain villagers positioned themselves near the refreshments table, not because they were thirsty, but because they were watching someone, or perhaps avoiding someone. The afternoon wore on in its usual gentle fashion. Conversations flitted from the mundane, crops, the weather, the upcoming village fete, to the quietly scandalous. Miss Marple made a point of sitting slightly apart, ostensibly enjoying a cup of tea, though in reality she was cataloguing mannerisms. A foot tapping too insistently beneath the daisies, a hand lingering too long on a champagne flute, a gaze darting with feigned nonchalance. It was when the party moved closer to the conservatory, where Mr. Hargreaves kept a small ornamental pool that reflected the glass ceiling like a silver mirror, that the stillness of the afternoon broke. "Edward, Edward, come quickly!" A high, sharp voice cut through the gentle murmur of conversation. Guests turned, startled. Miss Marple, sipping her tea with a serene air, noticed the sharp intake of breath among those standing nearby. By the time Mr. Hargreaves reached the source of the commotion, the sight that met his eyes sent a chill through the assembled crowd. At the center of the conservatory pool, floating face down in the shallow water, was the lifeless form of Mr. Philip Radcliffe, the young, ambitious solicitor whose recent dealings with several of Nethercombe's families had caused more than a few whispered disputes. Gasps echoed across the terrace, and someone fainted, only to be caught hastily by a nurse visiting from the village. In the chaos, Miss Marple remained calm, her mind already noting what might have caused this sudden tragedy. Was it an accident? Misstep on the polished tiles, or had someone turned the afternoon's polite gathering into a scene of deliberate malice? The police were summoned, and as officers began cordoning off the conservatory, villagers whispered, speculated, and cast glances at one another with a mixture of fear and accusation. Among them, only Miss Marple's eyes betrayed a flicker of certainty. Nothing in Nethercombe was ever as straightforward as it seemed. And with that thought, the quiet village of Nethercombe began to unravel, one secret at a time. The afternoon sun, once cheerful and golden, now seemed oddly muted, as if it had grown wary of the tension gathering in the conservatory. Word of Philip Radcliffe's untimely death spread quickly through the garden, carried on the rustle of silk dresses and the nervous shuffle of polished shoes. Voices lowered to whispers, and the polite smiles that had adorned faces just moments before vanished under the weight of shock and suspicion. Mrs. Brewster, her face pale beneath its usual powdering, clutched Miss Marple's hand with an urgency that was half fear, half curiosity. "I cannot imagine who would do such a thing," she murmured, though her eyes darted to those around them, as if hoping someone else might answer. The villagers, who had gathered in small, uneasy clusters, began to speculate openly. There was Mr. Harris, the local bank manager, muttering darkly about debts and jealousies. "He was far too clever for his own good," he said, nodding toward the still form in the water. Someone must have snapped. Beside him, Mrs. Langley, a widow whose late husband had once argued with Radcliffe over property lines, whispered to her companion, or perhaps it was retribution for old grievances. He did make enemies, you know. Miss Marple listened attentively, letting the chatter wash over her without a word. She noted how some villagers avoided certain glances, how Mr. Harris seemed almost too eager to suggest blame, how young Beatrice Fenton, for all her charm, looked stricken yet curiously calm. Even Mr. Hargreaves, usually the most composed of hosts, appeared oddly tense, brushing a hand nervously over the back of his neck as if trying to smooth away invisible wrinkles in the day's events. A uniformed constable arrived, polite but brisk, immediately taking control of the scene. Guests were asked to remain in the garden while the officers examined the conservatory and the pool. Some murmured compliance, others attempted casual deflections, questions, small talk, anything to distract themselves from the sight they had witnessed. Miss Marple observed them all quietly, sipping her tea that had long since cooled. It was in these small, almost imperceptible details, the way someone's eyes flicked to the exit, the subtle stiffening of a posture when a question was asked, that she began to sense the undercurrents of human nature at play. She noticed the young gardener, Thomas, standing a little too far back, his hands clenched as if holding in a secret, and the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, whose lips pressed together in a thin line, betraying both grief and something else, something more guarded. By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned, though the murmur of speculation remained a persistent hum. The police had questioned Mr. Hargreaves and a few nearby guests, taking statements that seemed to Miss Marple far too superficial. They were looking for the obvious, the misstep, the accidental fall, while she noted what they ignored, the interactions, the hesitations, the glances exchanged in silence. Philip Radcliffe was always ambitious, remarked Mrs. Brewster, leaning close. Everyone in Nethercombe knew that. Do you think that someone might have wanted him out of the way? Miss Marple allowed herself the barest hint of a smile. Ambition does not always announce itself in grand gestures, my dear. Sometimes it creeps along quietly, unseen, until the consequences are unavoidable. And as the sun began to dip behind the hedgerows, casting long, intricate shadows across the garden, Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of certainty. The village's outward calm was merely a thin veneer. Beneath it, hidden resentments, secret grudges, and carefully guarded motives were already beginning to reveal themselves, if one only knew how to look. For Miss Marple, the day's tragedy was not merely a shocking accident. It was the first note in a carefully composed symphony of human behavior, and she intended to hear every subtle, telling chord. As evening settled over Nethercombe, the village streets took on a hushed, almost conspiratorial air. The garden party had long since ended, leaving the estate cloaked in a quiet that felt heavy with questions and unspoken accusations. Inside the Hargreaves' residence, the investigators continued their methodical work, while the remaining guests drifted into the sitting room or along the terrace, their conversations muted and cautious. Miss Marple, with her keen eye and habitual patience, remained unobtrusive, seated near a bay window that overlooked the conservatory, her fingers lightly drumming a rhythm only she seemed to hear. She watched as Mr. Hargreaves moved restlessly between rooms, speaking in clipped tones to the police, and as Miss Beatrice Fenton, composed yet pale, attempted to maintain her usual grace. Both of them, she noted, were hiding something, not necessarily culpability, but a careful guarding of information. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the details, the way Beatrice's eyes flickered toward the pool whenever someone mentioned Philip, the slight hesitation in Mr. Hargreaves's step when recounting the events to the officers, the way their hands twitched as if brushing away invisible dust or memories. By the time Inspector Blunt requested to speak with a few of the villagers individually, speculation had spread through the estate like Wildfire. Mrs. Brewster and a few others remained in the drawing room, voices low but insistent, offering their interpretations of what might have occurred. One spoke of Philip's legal dealings, another of old family quarrels, a third of debts that had never been repaid. Each theory was layered with certainty and self-interest, a fascinating puzzle of perceptions for Miss Marple to examine. She was particularly attentive to the small things others dismissed: the smudge of soil on Thomas the gardener's sleeve, the faint scent of perfume clinging to the housekeeper's apron, the way Mrs. Langley continually tapped her fingers against her handbag, as though anxious to relay some half-remembered grievance. These, Miss Marple knew, were the clues the police would overlook, the subtle indications of motives, of tensions, of secrets yet unspoken. Later, when the officers returned to the drawing-room to speak with Mr. Hargreaves, the inspector's tone had grown impatient. "It must have been an accident," he stated bluntly, as if saying it often enough could make it true. "Slipped on the edge, perhaps. Young man's energy. Careless step. There is no evidence to suggest otherwise." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in a thin line. That was precisely the kind of conclusion she knew would never withstand scrutiny, because human nature rarely allowed a tragedy to be as simple as a misstep. She had observed too many gatherings, too many small village quarrels, to accept that a man with enemies, ambitions, and entanglements could meet death without purpose. As the officers left to follow up on their initial report, Miss Marple remained in her seat, sipping her tea now grown cold. Her gaze drifted to the conservatory beyond the glass, where the ornamental pool shimmered faintly in the last of the day's light. The image of Philip's face, pale and still, floated in her memory. Her mind began to piece together the village's rhythm, the patterns of interaction, the subtle avoidance of certain glances, the unspoken resentments that threaded through Nethercombe like invisible vines. Each detail, however minor, was a thread she intended to follow. In this quiet, after the immediate shock had passed, Miss Marple knew that the real story was beginning, layer upon intricate layer, and that only by listening, observing, and patiently waiting could she untangle it. By the time the household settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple had already formulated the first delicate outlines of what might have led to Philip Radcliffe's death. It would require careful attention, and above all, discretion. For in a village like Nethercombe, the truth often lay hidden in plain sight, obscured not by shadows, but by the very ordinary faces of those who thought themselves above suspicion. The next morning, Nethercombe awoke under a delicate haze of mist, the village seemingly unchanged, yet profoundly unsettled. Word of Philip Radcliffe's death had seeped into every corner, carried not by newspapers, but by the rapid and relentless gossip of neighbors. Shopkeepers whispered behind counters, children peered cautiously through hedges, and even the local vicar, usually the epitome of calm, found himself distracted by the tension that clung to every doorstep. Miss Marple, as ever, moved with the appearance of ordinary concern, though her mind was already working quietly through the threads of observation she had begun the previous day. She had stayed late at the Hargreaves' estate the evening before, speaking gently with Mrs. Brewster, listening to the villagers' half-formed theories, noting the subtle discomforts of each speaker. Now, with the sun rising behind the distant hills, she prepared to continue her quiet investigation, starting with those whose actions had struck her as oddly precise or uncharacteristically hesitant. At the tea-room, she found Mrs. Langley, who greeted her with a nervous, fluttering smile. "I suppose you heard," she whispered, glancing around as if the very walls might be listening. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful, but do you really think it could have been more than an accident?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with mild curiosity. "Accidents are not always what they seem, my dear. Sometimes a slip can hide a careful intention. Other times, people are far more involved than appearances suggest." She did not press further, letting the words hang lightly, giving Mrs. Langley a chance to reveal or conceal whatever she wished. Meanwhile, Thomas, the gardener, moved about with his usual diligence, yet Miss Marple noticed a subtle tension in his movements. He brushed a sleeve too quickly, avoiding the faint smudge of soil near his wrist, and his eyes flicked to the conservatory whenever the topic of Philip arose. The gardener's behavior was cautious, almost rehearsed, as if he were aware of eyes upon him but uncertain which ones to trust. Miss Marple filed this quietly away, noting that sometimes the smallest hand movements revealed far more than words ever could. Across the village, Mr. Hargreaves met with Inspector Blunt again, attempting to reassure himself and others that the tragedy could be neatly explained. Yet Miss Marple, listening from her seat in the corner, observed tiny cracks in his composure, a clenched jaw as he described Philip's activities, the way his hands trembled slightly while arranging papers, and the repeated, unnecessary insistence that Philip had been very careful with his steps. In the late morning, the villagers began to gather again at the estate under the pretense of offering condolences, though the air was thick with curiosity and suspicion. Conversations overlapped, each speaker eager to stake a claim on a narrative. He was ambitious, too ambitious for his own good, one would say, while another murmured, perhaps someone wanted to send a warning. The words swirled. Around Miss Marple, a chaotic but revealing tapestry of sentiment and motive. It was during this time that she noticed a minor detail overlooked by everyone else. A single scuff mark near the edge of the conservatory pool, faint but distinct, partially obscured by the polished stone. The mark alone revealed nothing conclusive, yet Miss Marple's mind registered it immediately as a thread worth following, a discrepancy in the story of a man supposedly so careful. She also observed that Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, lingered near the same spot, her apron spotless but her expression taut, as if she were guarding both something seen and something left unspoken. By midday, Miss Marple had begun to form a subtle mental map of relationships and tensions. Philip's ambition, the quiet resentments of the villagers, the hidden rivalries, the small but telling gestures that punctuated ordinary conversation. Unlike the police, she was not chasing the obvious. She was noting the overlooked, the incidental, the invisible strings that bound everyone together in a network of human nature. And so the day unfolded, not with loud revelations or dramatic confessions, but with the slow, steady accumulation of knowledge. For Miss Marple, each glance, each gesture, each hesitant word was a piece of the puzzle, and already she could sense that the solution would not be found in the water of the conservatory pool itself, but in the careful examination of those who surrounded it. The real investigation, she knew, had only just begun. By the afternoon, Nethercombe had settled into an uneasy rhythm, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The Hargreaves estate, though outwardly the picture of order, seemed charged with a subtle tension that no amount of servants, polished floors, or freshly arranged flowers could dissipate. Miss Marple wandered through the garden at her leisure, ostensibly enjoying the warm light on her shoulders, but in reality she was listening, observing, and quietly assessing every interaction with the precision of one who knew that human nature rarely revealed itself openly. She paused near a border of lavender, where a few villagers had gathered under the pretense of appreciating the blooms. In reality, their conversation was a careful dance of implication and half-truths. Mr. Harris, the bank manager, spoke in low tones, emphasizing Philip's recklessness and hinting that financial motives might have played a role in his demise. He was daring, perhaps too daring, he said. You never know who might have been crossed. Beside him, Mrs. Langley nodded, murmuring her agreement, though her eyes betrayed a curiosity about Thomas, the gardener, who stood quietly just out of earshot. Miss Marple made no move to join the group, but her presence was felt in the gentle attentiveness of her gaze. She noticed the subtle ways each person revealed themselves, The twitch of a hand, the careful avoidance of certain glances, the micro-expressions of hesitation when they spoke of Philip. Even the children who had come quietly to watch the proceedings from behind a hedge seemed to reflect the tension of the adults in their own small, unspoken ways. Later, Miss Marple made her way to the conservatory under the pretext of admiring the delicate water lilies in the pool. The police had left earlier, having taken their measurements and made their inquiries, yet she lingered, noting once more the faint scuff near the edge of the pool. It was a trivial detail, she knew, but it contradicted the official narrative of an accident. As she observed, Mrs. Pritchard appeared, carrying a tray of tea with deliberate precision, her expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her voice quiet but firm, "it's a terrible thing, isn't it? One would think such a place, with all its peace and order." She trailed off, leaving her sentiment unfinished. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "And yet peace and order often conceal more than they reveal. Sometimes the smallest sign tells us the most." She allowed the words to settle and watched Mrs. Pritchard's reaction, noting a slight hesitation before she turned to leave. That pause, so subtle, hinted at knowledge or awareness that she had yet to voice. Across the garden, Beatrice Fenton moved among the guests with her usual grace, yet there was an undercurrent of unease in her posture, a careful calculation in her every smile. Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting how she lingered near certain individuals, too close, too intentionally, to gauge reactions, to measure responses. There was a deliberate precision to her movements, a quiet attention that suggested both observation and, perhaps, concealment. By late afternoon, the villagers had begun to disperse, each returning to their routines, yet leaving behind the invisible threads of tension that Miss Marple had come to recognize so well. She remained in the conservatory a while longer, tracing the paths people had taken, replaying conversations in her mind, and examining the subtle cues that pointed toward hidden motives. It was then that she realized something. The apparent accident was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a network of small, often unnoticed actions and resentments. The water of the pool had claimed Philip Radcliffe, yes, but the hands that led him there were guided by human desires, fears, and deceptions. Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and unwavering attention, had begun to discern the outlines of those hands, the subtle fingerprints of intent that others were blind to. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the conservatory glass, she felt the first true stirrings of certainty. The answer, she knew, lay not in the water itself, but in the behavior, the hesitations, the minute gestures of those around her. And it was in observing these patterns, unnoticed by others, that Miss Marple would begin to untangle the web that had ensnared Philip Radcliffe and reveal the truth hidden behind Nethercomb's polite facades. As evening deepened over Nethercombe, a faint chill settled into the village, carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional distant bark of a dog. The Hargreaves' estate, though outwardly calm, was alive with quiet activity. Servants moved with measured purpose, tidying the conservatory and arranging refreshments for those who had lingered, while Miss Marple continued her unobtrusive observations, seated near the window that overlooked the garden and the still, ornamental pool. The arrival of a telegram from London had stirred a ripple of unease among the household. It was brief, unsigned, yet its content, merely a note stating that inquiries into Philip Radcliffe's professional dealings were underway, was enough to tighten the atmosphere. Miss Marple noted how the message had affected each person differently. Beatrice Fenton's fingers trembled slightly as she handed it to her uncle. Mr. Hargreaves' jaw tightened imperceptibly, and even Mrs. Pritchard's lips pressed together as if holding back words that were better left unspoken. By supper, the tension had become a delicate but persistent undercurrent. Conversations were careful, polite, yet charged with hidden meaning. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the edge of the dining room, allowed herself to listen more than speak, cataloguing gestures and tones with the patience that had long been her signature. The way Mr. Harris avoided meeting Thomas's eyes while discussing the local bank, the slight stiffness in Mrs. Langley's posture when the topic of Philip's legal work arose, the occasional furtive glance Beatrice cast toward the conservatory. All these, to the untrained eye, might have seemed inconsequential. To Miss Marple, they were pieces of a growing mosaic. Later, when the household had retired to the drawing-room for tea, Miss Marple found herself seated near Mr. Hargreaves, who was speaking with unusual candor. "Philip? Well, he was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I can't say that I disliked him, but sometimes one wonders whether ambition blinds a man to danger, or makes him more vulnerable to the less scrupulous." He trailed off, apparently unsure whether to continue. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her expression neutral. "Ambition can be a curious thing," she replied softly. "It often leads people into places they ought to avoid, or brings them into contact with those who would take advantage of their enthusiasm." She left her statement open-ended, observing the effect it had on him. There was a brief flicker in his eyes, a hesitation, a tiny concession that he quickly masked, yet it did not escape her notice. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple moved quietly to the conservatory, drawn by the familiar shimmer of the pool. She examined the faint scuff near the water's edge once again, her mind replaying the movements and interactions she had witnessed throughout the day. The mark was minor, almost trivial, yet it contradicted the narrative that Philip's fall had been purely accidental. A careful observer could see the evidence of something deliberate in its placement and pattern, though the police had dismissed it without thought. It was then that she noticed a folded piece of paper lying half hidden under a potted fern. Curiosity piqued, she retrieved it discreetly, noting that it bore the faintest traces of a hurried message. Financial accounts, perhaps, or a list of names, but the script was almost entirely smudged. Even in its obscurity, the paper suggested a connection between Philip's professional dealings and the village's hidden tensions. Miss Marple, with her quiet ingenuity, filed it mentally as another thread to follow. Footsteps echoed from the terrace, and she turned to see Beatrice Fenton standing there, framed by the dusky light. The young woman's composure was intact, yet her eyes held an intensity that betrayed both calculation and unease. "Miss Marple," she said softly, almost conspiratorially, "do you think it's possible someone wanted him to—" She did not finish, letting the implication linger. Miss Marple gave a faint, knowing smile. "It is possible," she replied gently, "though the answer is rarely found in what is said openly. One must look for what is hidden, what is avoided, and what is observed only in passing. Sometimes the smallest hesitation or the faintest reaction reveals far more than words ever could." Beatrice nodded, as if understanding the depth of her meaning, and retreated into the shadows of the conservatory. Miss Marple remained, sipping her tea and studying the reflections on the water's surface. Each ripple seemed to mirror not only the physical disturbance of the pool, but also the subtle currents of ambition, fear, and secrecy that ran through Nethercombe. By the end of the evening, Miss Marple felt that the first layers of the mystery were beginning to peel away. The death of Philip Radcliffe was no mere accident, she was certain, and the signs, though subtle, were already revealing the outlines of a hidden design. Patience and observation would be required, but she was confident that Nethercombe's secrets would not remain buried for long, especially with the careful attention of one who had long understood the silent language of human nature. The following morning arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind that seemed to settle over Nethercombe like a gentle shroud, blurring edges and softening details. Yet the mood among the villagers was anything but gentle. The previous day's tragedy had left a residue of unease that even the patter of rain could not wash away. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual modest attire and carrying a small umbrella, walked purposefully along the garden path of the Hargreaves' estate, noting the water gathering in the furrows of the lawn, the slick glint of stone on the terrace, and the faint tracks left behind by hurried steps. Each detail seemed to tell a story if one cared to look. Inside the house, Mr. Hargreaves had summoned a small group to discuss Philip's affairs. Miss Beatrice Fenton was present, her expression composed yet measured, her eyes occasionally flicking to the conservatory as though expecting a reflection to betray something hidden. The discussion was formal, restrained, but Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her teacup, noticed the subtle signs of tension. The tightening of Mr. Hargreaves's jaw, the way Beatrice's fingers tapped rhythmically against the table, the slight frown that appeared on Mrs. Pritchard's face whenever financial matters were mentioned. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered near the conservatory again, as if drawn to it by instinct. The pool, still shimmering despite the grey light, seemed to hold a quiet accusation, reflecting back not only the sky but the complexities of the human interactions that had unfolded around it. As she surveyed the space, she noticed Thomas, the gardener, working methodically yet with a careful awareness of his surroundings. He moved almost as if rehearsing steps, brushing a hand along the edge of a flower bed and avoiding the scuff mark she had noticed the day before. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the conversations drifting faintly from the house. Mr. Harris, speaking with Mrs. Langley under the shelter of the porch, whispered of Philip's recent professional successes, hinting that jealousy might have motivated someone to act against him. Nearby, another villager murmured about long-standing family grievances, each word layered with implication. To the casual observer, these were idle speculations. To Miss Marple, they were fragments of a larger, hidden narrative. It was mid-morning when a small incident confirmed what she had suspected. Beatrice, while inspecting the pool, had inadvertently knocked a small garden chair, and Miss Marple observed how she paused, eyes scanning the surrounding area, as though calculating the impressions of anyone watching. There was a deliberate precision in her movement, a careful consideration of how each action would be perceived. Such attentiveness suggested a consciousness not only of appearances, but of potential consequences. A subtle reflection of awareness that was rarely innocent. Miss Marple also noticed the way Mrs. Pritchard hovered at the edge of the room, offering tea and biscuits with impeccable timing, yet never speaking unnecessarily. The housekeeper's silence, combined with the occasional twitch of her hand when she thought no one was looking, suggested that she knew more than she was willing to admit, and that she, like the young gardener, was guarding details that might yet prove critical. By midday, the rain had eased, leaving the Ichia garden glistening with moisture and reflecting the diffused light in a manner that accentuated shadows along the conservatory walls. Miss Marple continued her quiet scrutiny, reviewing the subtle interplays she had observed. The ambition, the hesitations, the calculated glances, the small but telling gestures. Each action and reaction seemed to converge toward a single, inescapable truth. Philip Radcliffe's death had not been a simple accident. She began to see, with growing clarity, the intricate web of relationships and tensions that had ensnared him. Ambition, jealousy, hidden grievances, and delicate social maneuvering, all of these had intersected in ways that left outward appearances deceptively calm. Miss Marple understood, with that quiet certainty she had cultivated over a lifetime, that the true story lay not in the water of the pool, nor in the obvious conflicts, but in the subtle, unspoken cues that human beings inadvertently revealed to those who were patient enough to observe. And so, as the villagers retreated indoors to avoid the lingering drizzle, Miss Marple remained, seated by the conservatory window, her gaze fixed on the faintly rippling surface of the water. In its mirrored depth, she saw more than her own reflection. She glimpsed the first outlines of the secret design that had brought Philip Radcliffe to that fatal place. The puzzle was far from complete, but for the first time she felt the unmistakable stirrings of understanding, the beginning of the hidden story that only she, with her quiet patience and keen insight, would be able to untangle. By the early evening, the atmosphere at the Hargreaves estate had shifted into a tense quiet, broken only by the occasional murmur of servants tidying the conservatory and the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. The villagers who remained were drawn together, not by camaraderie but by shared uncertainty, each silently trying to assess the motives and movements of the others. Miss Marple, as always, took her place slightly apart, her posture calm, her eyes quietly attentive, cataloguing the small telling details that would escape anyone less observant. As she sat, she noticed Beatrice Fenton moving through the drawing-room with a careful grace, speaking softly to Mr. Harris about minor details of Philip's professional affairs. Her tone was measured, her expression serene, yet Miss Marple caught the subtle tension in her shoulders and the brief hesitation before she answered a question. A hesitation that betrayed both awareness and calculation. Beatrice's charm, Miss Marple realized, was as much a shield as it was an invitation. It diverted attention from what lay beneath. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, carried herself with the efficiency of someone accustomed to maintaining order in the face of disorder. Yet even she could not entirely conceal the faint tremor in her hands when she offered Miss Marple a cup of tea, nor the quick glance she cast toward the conservatory as though checking for an unseen presence. Miss Marple filed these observations carefully, noting the way small, involuntary gestures often revealed far more than words could convey. Thomas, the gardener, appeared at the open window, ostensibly arranging flowers, yet his movements were deliberate, controlled, as if he were constantly measuring how his actions would be perceived. Miss Marple had observed this pattern before. Individuals who were conscious of being watched often revealed their true priorities in the very effort to disguise them. She allowed herself a slight smile at the predictability of human behavior. As the evening progressed, a new piece of information arrived. A letter addressed to Philip Radcliffe had been found tucked inside the conservatory's desk. It was brief, unsigned, and bore only the faintest trace of ink smudges, suggesting haste or secrecy. Miss Marple, examining it quietly with a gentle touch, noted that its content hinted at a conflict, professional, perhaps personal, but left the specifics deliberately vague. The ambiguity was, in itself, a sign. Someone had intended Philip to see it, and someone else had hoped that its message would remain misunderstood. Later, as dusk settled over Nethercombe, Miss Marple took a slow walk along the terrace, her eyes once more on the conservatory pool. The faint scuff mark lingered in her mind, a subtle deviation from the narrative of an accidental fall. She considered each interaction she had witnessed, the guarded movements of Thomas, Beatrice's calculated attentions, Mrs. Pritchard's careful watchfulness, Mr. Hargreaves' almost imperceptible unease when discussing Philip's affairs. Each detail, minor though it might appear to the casual observer, formed part of a larger, intricate puzzle. She recalled the whispered speculations of the villagers, jealousy, ambition, old grievances, and quiet resentments, all intertwined in ways that seemed ordinary but carried hidden consequences. The patterns were beginning to emerge, not as accusations, but as a map of human motivations, each hinting at the unseen forces that could drive someone to act with lethal precision. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp cry from the far end of the garden. She turned swiftly, catching sight of a young maid who had stumbled near the edge of the terrace, startled by something she had seen. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, yet in that moment Miss Marple discerned not panic alone, but recognition, a glimpse of a secret too carefully guarded. The day was drawing to a close, yet for Miss Marple, the evening held the promise of revelation. The village's outward calm was a thin veneer, beneath which ambitions, fears, and subtle deceptions churned in quiet complexity. She understood that the next steps, careful observation, gentle questioning, and the patient testing of reactions, would soon bring the hidden threads into focus. And, In that anticipation, she felt the familiar stirrings of certainty. The truth of Philip Radcliffe's death was beginning to show itself, not in the water of the pool, but in the small telling movements of those who surrounded it. The next morning dawned bright and clear, though an undercurrent of unease lingered over Nethercombe. The tragedy of Philip Radcliffe's death continued to ripple through the village, subtle yet persistent, leaving a shadow across even the most familiar faces. Miss Marple, as ever, moved among the household and the grounds with quiet composure, her mind alert to the faintest irregularities, the small deviations in behavior that betrayed more than words ever could. At breakfast, conversation was guarded. Mr. Hargreaves spoke formally to the few remaining guests, recounting procedural details with a measured tone, while Beatrice Fenton assisted her uncle with an elegance that masked unease. Miss Marple, seated slightly apart, observed everything: the careful choice of words, the deliberate silences, the faint glances exchanged across the table. Each gesture, she knew, was a clue, however minor it might appear. Thomas, the gardener, moved among the flower beds outside, ostensibly tending the roses, yet Miss Marple could see the subtle tension in his shoulders and the quick, vigilant glances he cast toward the house. There was a measured precision in his movements that suggested more than simple diligence. It hinted at awareness, perhaps of secrets he hoped no one would uncover. Later, Miss Marple ventured into the conservatory, where the ornamental pool reflected the morning light with deceptive serenity. The faint scuff near the pool's edge caught her eye once more, and she considered the placement carefully. It was minor, almost trivial, yet in its misalignment lay the proof that not everything about Philip's fall had been accidental. Her mind replayed the interactions of the past days. Beatrice's controlled attentions, the housekeeper's guarded movements, Thomas's quiet vigilance, and Mr. Hargreaves's subtle unease. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Blunt, who had returned with a sense of urgency. He spoke in low tones, discussing procedural details and recounting findings from the London inquiries into Philip's affairs. Miss Marple listened with polite attention, noting the inspector's focus on tangible evidence and the way he seemed eager to close the case on what he believed was an accident. To her, it was all too superficial. Human behavior, she knew, would speak far louder than any official report. As the morning wore on, subtle tensions began to surface among the remaining villagers. Mrs. Langley, for instance, lingered near the conservatory, her expressions flickering between curiosity and unease whenever Beatrice or Mr. Hargreaves entered the room. Mr. Harris, the bank manager, seemed unusually attentive to minor details, his eyes scanning each person's movements as if searching for signs of concealed motives. Miss Marple catalogued these behaviors, forming a quiet map of relationships, hesitations, and unspoken resentments. Midday brought another discovery: a small, seemingly insignificant envelope, half hidden behind a vase in the conservatory. Inside were letters and notes suggesting that Philip had been negotiating, or perhaps threatening, several of the villagers over financial and legal matters. Miss Marple handled them delicately, recognizing the subtle implication. There were motives, yes, but not all were equally obvious, and some were far more personal than professional. It was during this careful scrutiny that Beatrice Fenton appeared once more, her expression composed but her eyes betraying a tension she could not fully mask. She spoke with the polite insistence of someone accustomed to social propriety, yet Miss Marple noted how each word was measured, each phrase carefully calculated. There was a consciousness in her tone, an awareness of observation, as though she understood that someone was quietly watching every reaction. Miss Marple remained still, her eyes following the young woman, noting the subtle ways she shifted her weight, the brief pauses, the moments when her gaze faltered. And in these almost imperceptible cues, Miss Marple recognized patterns of thought, hints of guilt or knowledge, in the intricate web of connections that tied the villagers together in ways both visible and hidden. By late afternoon, The contours of the mystery had begun to take shape. Philip Radcliffe's death, though outwardly a tragic accident, was revealing itself to be the product of careful orchestration, subtle pressures, and human ambition. Miss Marple, with her unerring patience, had begun to trace the faint lines of intent and deception, understanding that the final revelation would hinge not on what was spoken aloud, but on the delicate, unguarded gestures that only an observant eye could see. And as she looked once more into the still waters of the conservatory pool, she felt that the hidden truths of Nethercombe were about to surface, in time, for those patient enough to witness them. As twilight descended upon Nethercombe, the estate took on a muted, almost contemplative quiet. The garden, earlier lively with whispers and anxious glances, now seemed to hold its breath under the dimming light, the conservatory pool reflecting the sky in subdued shades of rose and grey. Inside, the household had settled into a careful calm, each person occupied with seemingly trivial tasks, tidying, arranging tea, or speaking in measured tones. Yet Miss Marple could sense the subtle undercurrent of unease that threaded through the walls. She remained near the conservatory, her keen eyes observing the faint reflections on the water's surface, noting the smallest deviations in movement and posture among the residents and visitors still present. Beatrice Fenton appeared, standing just within the glass doors, her expression composed yet alert, her hands lightly folded before her. Miss Marple watched as she shifted her weight from foot to foot, pausing momentarily before answering a casual remark from Mr. Harris. There was a deliberation in each gesture, a consciousness of observation, as though every movement had been calculated to convey innocence while concealing intent. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, hovered discreetly at the edge of the room, her face a careful mask of composure. Yet Miss Marple detected the subtle signals, a fleeting twitch of the fingers, a brief tightening of the lips when conversation turned to Philip's affairs. The housekeeper's careful attention to detail suggested she knew more than she had disclosed, and that she, too, was guarding secrets that might prove crucial. Thomas the gardener moved outside, ostensibly inspecting the flower beds, yet Miss Marple noted the careful pacing, the frequent glances toward the conservatory, the slight hesitation before touching anything near the pool. Even in his actions she saw evidence of awareness and caution, subtle indicators of knowledge or perhaps complicity that were easily overlooked by anyone less observant. The quiet was broken by the sound of the front door opening. Mr. Hargreaves returned from a brief walk, his expression marked by a faint tension that had not been there earlier. He carried with him a small bundle of letters, documents he claimed had been delivered that morning, and which he insisted were routine. Yet Miss Marple noted the way his hands trembled slightly as he set them down, the careful avoidance of Beatrice's gaze, the quick check of the conservatory before he spoke. It was a performance of normalcy, yet one strained by hidden anxieties. Later, as the evening deepened and the household retired to the drawing-room, Miss Marple subtly observed the interactions, testing reactions with gentle prompts and casual remarks. A question about Philip's recent consultations drew a faint flinch from Beatrice, a momentary hesitation from Mr. Hargreaves, and a fleeting tightening of Mrs. Pritchard's lips. Even the briefest pause, the smallest twitch, held significance. Miss Marple understood that the truth was not in dramatic confessions or in overt gestures, but in these minor hesitations and small, unconscious revelations. Each villager had contributed, knowingly or not, to the pattern that had led to Philip Radcliffe's death. His ambition, his dealings, the rivalries and resentments that wove through the village, all had intersected, each adding a subtle stroke to the larger, concealed picture. By nightfall, the village of Nethercombe had quieted, yet Miss Marple's mind remained alert, threading together the disparate details she had observed. The scuff at the edge of the pool, the careful movements of Thomas, the controlled composure of Beatrice, the guarded attentions of Mrs. Pritchard, and the faint anxieties of Mr. Hargreaves All these elements, when considered together, began to reveal the outlines of a carefully orchestrated design. Miss Marple knew that the culmination of these observations, the unveiling of hidden motives and concealed intentions, was drawing near. The evening's calm was but a veneer. Beneath it, the currents of ambition, fear, and human cunning were converging, and she, with her patient watchfulness and deep understanding of human nature, was prepared to follow those currents wherever they led, knowing that the true resolution of Philip Radcliffe's death rested not on the obvious, but on the subtle, telling truths that only she had the insight to perceive. The following morning, the sun rose over Nethercombe with a soft, golden clarity that belied the undercurrent of tension still lingering in the village. Miss Marple, as was her custom, arrived at the Hargreaves' estate early, her small frame moving quietly among the dew-dampened flower beds. She paused at the edge of the conservatory pool, tracing the faint scuff marks along the stone rim with her keen, deliberate gaze. The accident theory held less weight with each observation she made. The evidence, subtle though it was, suggested intention rather than misfortune. Inside, the household was awake but subdued. Mr. Hargreaves moved about with polite efficiency, though his movements betrayed the faintest hints of anxiety. Slight hesitations before opening letters, careful avoidance of certain glances, and the occasional clench of his jaw when discussions turned to Philip's affairs. Beatrice Fenton, ever composed, circulated among the staff with a calm demeanor that masked a palpable attentiveness, her eyes flicking frequently toward the conservatory and the pool as if measuring the impact of each moment. Miss Marple took tea in the drawing-room, seated where she could observe without attracting attention. She listened to Mrs. Pritchard recount trivial details of the morning's chores, noting how carefully the housekeeper chose her words, the subtle inflections that betrayed both knowledge and caution. Each small deviation, each pause, each glance was a potential thread, and Miss Marple's mind catalogued them with quiet precision. By mid-morning, she had begun to orchestrate her own subtle tests, posing casual questions, watching reactions, and introducing minute discrepancies in conversation to gauge responses. She inquired, lightly and without apparent intent, about Philip's last movements near the pool. Noting the brief tension in Mr. Hargreaves' posture, the quick intake of breath from Beatrice, and the near imperceptible shift in Mrs. Pritchard's stance. It was the quietest of games, yet one that revealed more than any formal questioning could hope to extract. Miss Marple then invited Thomas, the gardener, to accompany her in examining the grounds. "It is a curious morning," she remarked, her tone gentle, "and sometimes the earth itself remembers more than we think." Thomas nodded, compliant but guarded, moving carefully along the garden paths, his eyes occasionally darting toward the conservatory. Miss Marple allowed him to work, observing the subtle nervousness in his posture, the way his fingers brushed against the edges of flower beds, and the faint, deliberate steps that avoided the scuff near the pool. As the day wore on, fragments of hidden truths began to coalesce in her mind. Letters and notes found in the conservatory hinted at disputes over financial arrangements and professional grievances, but Miss Marple suspected the real motives were far more personal, intertwined with the subtle tensions she had been observing for days. Each villager carried a story, and each story contained threads of resentment, ambition, or secret knowledge that could, if misapplied, lead to tragedy. By late afternoon, Miss Marple arranged a seemingly casual gathering in the drawing-room, inviting the key figures, the Hargreaves family, Beatrice, Mr. Harris, Mrs. Langley, and even Mrs. Pritchard, to join her over tea. Her questions were framed as innocent curiosity, yet every phrase was designed to provoke the faintest, most telling reactions. A careful mention of Philip's movements in the conservatory, a gentle reminder of the scuff at the pool's edge, subtle references to letters and documents, all were measured to observe, not to accuse. Eyes flickered, lips tightened, Hands moved with hesitation. Miss Marple noted the nuances of every reaction. Beatrice's careful composure masking a momentary flash of awareness, Mr. Hargreaves's deliberate attempt to steady his voice and posture, Mrs. Pritchard's barely perceptible swallow as she passed the teacups. Even Mr. Harris, normally confident in his authority, showed the faintest tremor in his hand when a particular letter was mentioned. As evening descended, the pattern became unmistakable to Miss Marple. The outward calm, the polite civility, and the carefully maintained facades were mere veils over a web of ambition, resentment, and human cunning. Philip Radcliffe's death had been orchestrated with subtle precision, guided not by force but by manipulation, small acts, and calculated inattention. And now, after days of patient observation, Miss Marple felt certain that the threads were ready to be drawn together, that the hidden motives were prepared to reveal themselves, and that the final, decisive test, carefully devised, would soon uncover the truth. As the evening shadows lengthened across the Hargreaves estate, Miss Marple moved quietly into the drawing-room, her presence unassuming yet entirely attentive. The small gathering she had arranged earlier had lingered, each participant cautiously polite, exchanging measured words while their minds churned with private conjectures. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth with her teacup resting lightly in her hands, observed every micro-expression, every subtle shift in posture, every hesitation in speech, knowing that in these small acts the truth often revealed itself. She began her gentle orchestration, speaking in tones of casual curiosity. "It is remarkable," she said, "how one small detail can sometimes change the understanding of an entire event. For instance, the edge of the conservatory pool, where a slight scuff has appeared. It is hardly noticeable, yet it hints at something unexpected." Her gaze swept lightly across the room, resting for just a moment on each face, noting reactions. Beatrice Fenton, maintaining her composed demeanor, replied cautiously, "Yes, I suppose so, though such things might happen by accident." Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple observed a fleeting tightening around the eyes, the subtle clench of her jaw, evidence that her words were measured, defensive even. Mr. Hargreaves shifted slightly in his chair, fingers tightening on the arms, a nervous tick of hesitation that betrayed unease. Mrs. Pritchard, standing near the tea-table, offered a polite smile, yet Miss Marple noticed her hands trembled barely perceptibly as she refilled the cups. Even Mr. Harris, confident in most social settings, allowed a flicker of uncertainty to cross his features. Each reaction was a carefully painted stroke on the canvas of truth, and Miss Marple read it all with patient clarity. She continued weaving her observations into casual questions, referencing Philip Radcliffe's professional concerns, his ambitions, the letters and notes discovered in the conservatory. Her words were gentle, indirect, yet each phrase pressed lightly against hidden nerves. "One wonders," she said softly, "how small actions, overlooked by some, can have consequences that none anticipate. A missed step, an unnoticed glance, a letter left unopened. They may seem trivial, yet sometimes they lead to far more serious outcomes." A slight pause followed, and then Miss Marple invited each person, one by one, to recount Philip's movements during the day of the tragedy. The retelling was careful, polite, yet through her subtle prompts, she noticed inconsistencies, minute deviations in timing, small contradictions in gestures, and the faintest signs of tension when certain names or locations were mentioned. Each hesitation, each carefully chosen word, became a part of the pattern she had been patiently assembling. Finally, with the atmosphere quietly taut, Miss Marple allowed her observations to coalesce. "It appears," she said, her tone gentle yet firm, "that Philip Radcliffe's fall into the conservatory pool was not as accidental as we have been led to believe. There were too many small, deliberate actions, too many hesitations and precautions by those present to suggest that this was simply misfortune. Indeed, it seems that one among us allowed circumstances to unfold in a way that ensured his demise. She looked calmly around the circle, her eyes soft but unwavering, letting the weight of her words settle. A sharp intake of breath, a shifting in chairs, and the faintest gasp punctuated the room, yet Miss Marple continued with her quiet certainty. She explained, step by step, the subtle clues she had observed. The scuff by the pool, the careful avoidance of glances, the precise timing of movements, the reactions to casual mentions of letters and documents. Each detail, minor on its own, fit into a larger design, one that revealed both intent and opportunity. Beatrice Fenton's composure finally cracked, a flicker of recognition crossing her face, followed by a faint pallor. Mr. Hargreaves, realizing the pattern Miss Marple had uncovered, leaned forward, eyes narrowing as understanding dawned. Even Mrs. Pritchard's hands stilled, the gentle tremor ceasing as she absorbed the truth. Miss Marple concluded with her characteristic clarity and compassion. "The truth," she said softly, "is seldom hidden by malice alone, but by careful concealment, by subtlety, and by our own assumptions. Yet human nature leaves traces, and when one observes closely and patiently, as we have, the story reveals itself in full. The orchestrator of this tragedy acted with knowledge, with calculation, and with the belief that others would overlook the smallest of signs. But here, in this quiet house, no detail was too small to escape notice." A hush fell over the room, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock. The villagers, stunned by the clarity of her revelation, finally absorbed the truth. Philip Radcliffe's death had been deliberate, concealed within the ordinary rhythms of village life, and exposed only through the patient, gentle, and unerring insight of Miss Marple. The estate, and indeed the village, would never be quite the same again, yet in the quiet aftermath there was a measure of resolution, a recognition that subtle observation and understanding of human nature had prevailed over concealment and deceit. Miss Marple, quietly placing her teacup down, allowed herself a faint smile. The mystery had been solved, the hidden design revealed, and as she glanced toward the shimmering surface of the conservatory pool, she reflected once more on the delicate balance of ambition, secrecy, and human folly that so often shaped the fates of those around her.